Our presenter today is Adam Berman. Adam, I think it's time. Take it away.
Awesome. Great. Sounds like the mic is working. Hey, folks. My name's Adam. I'm going to be talking about when is a vulnerability not a vulnerability, overcoming the inundation of supply chain security alerts. A little bit about me. My name is Adam Berman. I lead the SemGrip supply chain team at SemGrip. I lead the engineering and product org for our product. I started as a staff engineer here at SemGrip back when it was called R2C. Have the pleasure of getting to build security tools, many of which are open source. If you haven't used SemGrip before, give it a shot. It's a pretty cool tool. And yeah, I work at SemGrip. We build the open source static analysis tool, and we're focused on security generally. So I want to first start with who's ever opened up their code base or security tool and seen a tab with a big alert that looks something like this. I think the reality is, if this were true, if all these vulnerabilities were really dangerous in our applications, we'd all be fired, right? We all know this isn't real. So many of these alerts are just not that dangerous. So few represent a real risk to the business. The trick is finding those real dangerous needles in the haystack, because those can't be ignored. And the real trick is finding those needles without having to overwhelm your team with a huge quantity of work. So today, we're going to talk about some strategies for that. We're going to talk about the rise of open source usage, what that means for security. We're going to talk about traditional software composition analysis tools, how they work, the challenge of running an effective SCA program, and then we're going to dive into what reachability analysis is and how it can help folks move up a level in terms of their leverage. Okay, so I hope at the end of the talk we can get to some strategies. I'm sorry, not ignoring alerts, but reducing alerts so that this can help security and developers be partners together. So we'll start with the rise of open source software. It's a tale of velocity, but also risk. So open source software usage has massively increased. I think when I started, it was writing software. It was popular and common, but today it's the overwhelming percentage of the lines of code in our applications come from open source software. This is good. This means that open source projects, this is happening because open source projects are solving problems that are generic to all of us. We're a startup. We don't want to have to figure out how to render HTML. We don't want to have to figure out how to parse a cookie or spend our time doing that. Instead, we use React and Flask and a bunch of other open source projects that implement that functionality really well, and we get to move on to other things that are important for our business. I get to spend more of my engineering time on things that are unique to us. But the downside is that we also inherit all of the security problems of the open source tools we bring in, and we don't always do that with our eyes wide open to those problems. These old vulnerabilities live forever. They're out there continuously. Hackers keep blasting the internet, seeing if anyone is using vulnerable versions. These are our logs from a few months ago, catching some of the spam. This is especially funny to us. We don't use WordPress anywhere, but we still pick up people trying to see old WordPress versions in the wild. And looking at the rate of disclosures for open source vulnerabilities, it just keeps on going up. So last year, I think we saw something like 22,000 vulnerabilities disclosed. Over the last 3 months, we've seen 8,000 new vulnerabilities disclosed. We can just see this is going to increase more and more over time. And that doesn't even take into account folks who are running microservices or projects with multiple lock files where a single unique vulnerability disclosure might compound and multiply out across the many applications that you care about. Think about how many services your teams are supporting. Think about how many alerts you get when a disclosure happens on your support week. A single new disclosure can account for tens or hundreds, maybe sometimes thousands in large companies of vulnerabilities across a large number of projects. And then the security team has to understand the context for each application in order to triage it. The worst part about this is that a huge percentage of those vulnerabilities are false positives. We ran a study of 1,100 of the most popular open source packages with vulnerabilities, and our analysis showed that about 2% of reported vulnerabilities are even theoretically reachable, never mind exploitable. We've replicated these results on customer code and enterprise environments as well, and this means that SCA programs are typically really low ROI. So before we dive into how to fix this, let's back up a bit and figure out how we ended up here in the first place. So I want to talk about traditional SCA tools. How do they work? There are a lot of tools that most of us might use for SCA. There are free tools like OAuth Dependency Track and Dependabot. There are paid solutions like Black Duck and Sneak. But fundamentally, these tools are pretty similar when it comes to vulnerability management. First, they collect a database of vulnerabilities. These are sourced from public vulnerability databases like NVD. Perhaps companies have their own security research team investigating packages and finding new vulnerabilities. But each database entry is going to look something like this: a package, a vulnerable version or a version range, the minimum patched version, and then ideally they'll also be accompanied by helpful information like a description, a recommendation, a severity. This is like a pretty good database entry, helps you understand what's going on with this vulnerability. But then they have to, so then the next phase, the next thing they have to be able to do is they have to be able to scan your dependencies. Perhaps they scan your manifest file or your lock file. They might query your build system for the list, but they have to be able to see, okay, what dependencies are in my system. Here we're showing a lock file giving you the list of dependencies in the system. Finally, they have to match the package versions back to the database. And then they tell you, hey, do you have a vulnerable version of a package in your system? So at the end of the day, you end up with a list like this of vulnerable packages in your ecosystem. So what's the issue here? The problem is this is not a list of vulnerabilities that are exposed in your system. Instead, it's a list of packages that have vulnerabilities that are in your system. The vast majority of packages that might show up on this list are not dangerous based off how they're being used in that specific application. For a package to be dangerous, the first-party code typically has to use the vulnerable part of the library in a specific way. So let's take this Lodash vulnerability as an example. What is Lodash? Well, it's a JavaScript utility library with, let's see if this will go. Nope, maybe it won't. Okay. A few hundred public functions on it. There's supposed to be a video that like scrolls through 1 million pages of documentation. It's a really large utility library. It has hundreds of functions on it. This vulnerability here says that merge with is vulnerable to prototype pollution. But the whole library isn't vulnerable at that version. Just this function and a few more that also have disclosures associated with them like merge and merge deep. If, say, I use Lodash's partition method to manipulate an array, I'm totally safe. Partition is not vulnerable, does not rely on any of the vulnerable methods, so there's no undue risk added to my application. Now, looking back at this list, you might be thinking, why not just fix all of them anyway? And if there are only 5, like, absolutely, that might be easy, and we all want to live in a world where all vulnerabilities are fixed all of the time, and everything is rainbows and unicorns. But many of us work at places where getting to inbox 0 is just not feasible. Instead, we're closer to here, a huge or perhaps even unknown number of vulnerabilities to triage. So let's talk about why is it so hard to get to inbox 0? Shouldn't we be able to just upgrade our way out of this mess? Well, in reality, upgrading is rarely quite that simple. Organizations are pretty rarely only one version behind. When a vulnerability is disclosed or being addressed, we might be dozens of versions behind the closest safe version. In the best case scenario, when you have a rock solid test suite, you still need the developer bandwidth to fix the upgrades that have breaking changes. And in most scenarios, when you don't have a really good test suite, you also have to do the manual work to figure out if there are breaking changes in the first place. And you may need to land a fix for each vulnerability across a breadth of services at your organization, which means you have to rinse and repeat for the test suite, for the testing, for the manual testing, for each of those applications. And developers have a lot of different concerns. They have to build features, scale existing features, pay down tech debt, fix bugs, scope out new work. Upgrades and other security work have to be balanced against all of these competing needs. But there's a really tough trade-off here. Security teams face similar time constraints with asks from across the business. Prioritizing triage time takes away from other important work. And since vulnerabilities keep getting disclosed, this is a forever commitment. You'll be forever pushing this boulder up the hill. So security teams are often faced with an extremely difficult choice, balancing the value against the resources required for an SCA program in a resource-constrained environment. So for some companies, for some organizations, running a security-focused SCA program just isn't worth it. It's too much work for too little reward, and instead the goal becomes meeting the minimum bar for compliance. Folks might turn on a tool that can check the compliance box and ignore the rest of the results and accept the risk. For others, they cannot accept the risk. The needle in the haystack is too dangerous, and so folks commit to manually triaging these alerts so they can find the few real vulnerabilities to forward to the development teams. And this is a really terrible trade-off. Okay, so the crux of the talk here is that reachability analysis helps you escape from that choice and move a level up and work on higher leverage work here. So reachability analysis helps security teams run a more scalable and pragmatic SCA program. It lets us ignore or deprioritize less urgent vulnerabilities in the ever-growing background tasks, a queue of background tasks. It also lets us find and immediately address the vulnerabilities that are the most pressing today so that we can be strategic with our triage time. And then it also lets us codify acceptable and unacceptable uses of packages with known vulnerabilities so that developers can fix and self-serve to prevent real security issues without having to spend a lot of time on upgrades that aren't useful today. Okay, so what is reachability analysis? How does it work? Let's dive in. Reachability analysis is a process by which we check to see if the vulnerable part of the library is used. We call it reachable when the dangerous part of a vulnerable package is used by the first-party code. So let's go over an example. Here we import Lodash, and let's say it's at a vulnerable version. On line 5 here, we see evidence of reachability. We see the program has called the dangerous function on the library with potentially untrusted user input. And then on line 8, we see how a user might be able to get a malicious input into the vulnerable function. Here we see a very similar function. Same user input, same library, but we're calling the zip function, which we know not to be vulnerable. We know it doesn't utilize any of the vulnerable functionality in Lodash. Thus, we'd call the vulnerability in this context unreachable. I want to make an important distinction. This is different from exploitability. A vulnerability might be reachable, but still not exploitable. Exploitability requires a lot more context, the environment, the infrastructure. You have to know how the software is really being used in practice. And it's a much higher bar, much more difficult to automate this detection. But so if we go back to our previous example, from this code sample, we can't tell if this script is exploitable. Reachability analysis is this lower bar. Basically, does the code touch the vulnerable part of the library? And it has a nice property that it's much easier to automate the detection of reachability. Okay, so how do you do reachability analysis? This has 3 parts. The first part is an engine of some kind that can scan the code and detect, well, like some pattern. So a nice property of reachability analysis is this can be done with static analysis. We don't need to compile the code or test it dynamically. At SemGrep, we've built and maintained the open source static analysis tool SemGrep. We just changed our name. I don't really know how to say. At SemGrep, we build SemGrep. This works really well for analysis like this, and I'll show some examples in a bit. On the lightweight side, you can use something as simple as grep. You might use a language-specific linter like Rubocop or ESLint. If you have access to something like CodeQL, you might be able to wire up something like this too. Second, you need an engine that can tell what version of the library is being used in an application. There are a lot of great free tools like this. SemGrep does this, but OWASP Dependency Track does this, Dependabot does this. There's a lot of good tools for this. And finally, you need a database of vulnerabilities, and you need to know the list of vulnerable functions for a library at a particular version and under what conditions those functions are dangerous. Now, here, there is no silver bullet. This is going to require a little bit of work, a decent amount of security knowledge, some elbow grease, but essentially you flip the switch on triaging a vulnerability. It means rather than digging into your own code to see how you use the library, it means digging into the vulnerable library and looking at the patch diff, reading blog posts on successful exploits, stuff like that, in order to figure out what makes this library dangerous at this particular version. So, right, so we've also found that there are some open source databases that are beginning to have some of these lists of vulnerable functions. There's an effort in the open source community through tools like OSV to try to provide that information more readily. We're trying to get involved with these resources as well. I want to give I'll give an example of like how this works in practice. Towards the end of 2022, we saw a disclosure in the PyTorch library. Looking at the issue on the library itself, it doesn't take very long to figure out what's dangerous about the library. Someone even did a great job of demonstrating the exploit in the comments on the issue. So you can see exactly the function that needs to be called for it to be dangerous and what that looks like in the wild. So then the next step is actually writing a rule. So you look at the engine, you specify that, okay, this is a PyTorch, this is for Python. You write a message that helps a developer perhaps understand why they need to fix this. And then you specify the pattern. So here we specify the pattern. Here's what needs to be called for this vulnerability to be dangerous. Then the second part is the engine for matching the dependency version. We can run this rule against a code base, see if it's used at all, and then to see whether or not it's reachable or unreachable. So here we specify are you using the library at the known dangerous versions. Now that we have some rules, we can talk about how we build reachability into our SCA program at all. So let's zoom out for a second. Think about how vulnerabilities might show up in our systems. There are two main vectors of vulnerability risk. One is new disclosures, and the other is new commits. So the first, a new disclosure. New disclosure is going to impact old code, code that hasn't been touched in years, code that you really thought was safe, but now it turns out that that Nokigiri XML parser that you thought was safe wasn't safe after all. We need to either spend some time sanitizing the input, or we need to upgrade. So how do we protect ourselves against these kinds of disclosures? Here, to do reachability analysis, you want to be able to run scans basically ad hoc, at request time. You might build a script that pulls your repos and scans the whole repo with this new rule once you've written it for this disclosure. If you use a standard static analysis tool, these scans are going to be dominated by how long it takes to pull the code rather than running the scan itself typically. So a lot of folks have worked on like kind of nightly or hourly crons pre-scheduled in CI, so that when you check in your rule, it's going to automatically get a scan in your next run, and then you'll be able to get a result pretty quickly. The second vector is new or changed code. So once you've scanned or confirmed at the time, so when someone's checked in some code, when a new disclosure comes out, you've scanned, you've confirmed at the time of the disclosure, the vulnerability doesn't exist in your code base, but people don't stop changing their code. People keep adding new code, they keep on making changes to existing code, and someone checks in maybe a new library or makes use of a library in a new way, and all of a sudden that library's vulnerability is reachable. What we want to do is we want to put a guardrail in place to prevent developers from introducing new reachable vulnerabilities. So to do these, folks typically instrument PR scans to make sure that code changes don't let in newly reachable vulnerabilities. This is ideal. It lets developers self-serve a fix, especially if you can add a comment when it fails a PR check. And you can make it blocking to ensure vulnerabilities never make it to production. For some orgs that like PR comments are blocking, is it quite feasible? You can orchestrate this also with out-of-band scans that allow security teams to fast follow with fixes without slowing down developers. Cool, so running a reachability program, kind of in action, here's what it looks like. You hook up a feed to some vulnerability database so you get notified when new vulnerabilities are disclosed. I think a lot of folks have something like this already in place with something like Dependabot or Vulnerability Tracker. When a vulnerability comes through, then rather than jumping into your code to triage, you dig into the vulnerability itself. If there's a single function that's vulnerable or particular kinds of inputs that make it vulnerable, you then write a rule to codify like what is acceptable usage, what is not. You scan your existing code base to excise parts that might be vulnerable today, and then you check in a guardrail to make sure the vulnerability doesn't become reachable in the future. Okay, so reachability lets folks scale and run a more effective pragmatic SCA program, but I think this allows your security team really to level up and work on at a higher leverage point of view. Takes you from manual toil to allowing you to automate away your current and future work. But I think I want to say this is by no means bulletproof. Static analysis is imperfect. There are false positives and false negatives, as with any analysis technique. But our goal here is to run something pragmatic. There are some vulnerabilities that are so bad you want to excise them no matter what. So, log4j, things like that, you just want to get out of your system. You might not trust reachability analysis for. I think it's also important to remember there's not a trivial amount of work researching and writing your own rules for reachability program. But especially for orgs with multiple services and multiple applications, this lets you scale a single research effort rather than having to manually triage each vulnerability by hand. I think if you don't want to run this program yourself, there are products out there that do this. SemGrep has a product that does this, but there are a variety of other SCA tools that do this as well. And we kind of want to push to make this the de facto standard that SCA tools should have reachability. But it's something every org has to evaluate for themselves, whether they want to build it or buy it. But I think the key part of security here isn't a purity test. If we can only have security in a world in which every vulnerability is upgraded, we're on inbox 0, it's going to be hard for a lot of organizations. We believe in pragmatic security, and pragmatic security should not require so much toil. Thanks for having me. Come join our community Slack at SemGrep. We're also hiring quite a bit, so would love to chat with you all if you're interested. Thanks so much. Yeah, so the question is why capture reachability early if reachability doesn't mean exploitable? I think the idea is that the number of exploitable vulnerabilities is a subset of the reachable vulnerabilities, but that reachability already filters out a ton of vulnerabilities that aren't exploitable and that you don't have to look at because they're not reachable either. So if you start with a list of 1,000 vulnerabilities, if we can get you down to the 10 that are reachable and then help you find the 5 within that are exploitable, it really cuts down the amount of triage time. So there is still some triage to do, figure out which of those are exploitable, but it helps you kind of get past the other 990 that aren't exploitable or reachable. Sure. Yeah.
A lot of the dependency alerts that I've seen can be a dependency of a dependency of a dependency.
Yeah.
The scanning engines that can the code engine. Let's not use the mic.
Mic swap.
Can the code scanning engines that you highlighted trace the call stack to understand like reachability even when the function is used very deep within the stack?
Yeah, not all of them can. There are some that can, there are some that cannot. What we've also found, there's like a multiplication factor here where it's like, okay, if 2% of vulnerabilities are reachable in direct dependencies, then 2% of the vulnerabilities in those dependencies are reachable. We're at 0.04%. So it starts to become like incredibly difficult and a very tailored attack that I have to get through. So in terms of risk management, it's often not like the top thing that you have to worry about. But I think for the truth of the matter is like a lot of them cannot, and it's like, you can't grep your way through, or maybe you can, but then like that'd be something you'd have to wire up, is you have to grep your way through a call stack.
Thanks.
Folks, due to time constraints. Due to time constraints, folks, we probably need to just take the questions outside. I got a freestyle question cipher with Adam, okay?
Yep, I'll be out in the hallway for anyone, or maybe I shouldn't be in the hallway. I'm not sure if you want me in the hallway. I'll be by the concessions area if people have questions. Thanks, folks.